Welcome to week 4 of assessment and psychopathology for spring 2025. Just some notes for the upcoming week and a couple of comments about the previous week. I hope that you got a good sense of kind of how the DSM is set up, the few changes. I mean, there were some significant changes from the 5 to the 5TR, but not as significant as the changes from the 4TR to the 5, which Dr. Marbury covers in the lectures. I am enjoying making my way through the video clips that you all put and your thoughts on them. It's always amazing the variety, when you do an assignment like this, the variety of sources that you all found. So it's really interesting to read through, watch some of the videos and read through them. If you have a few minutes, I would encourage you to watch some of your classmates' videos that they posted that might be different from yours, just because it's watching, especially the ones that are like an example of mental status exam, are interesting to watch to get different ideas for how you can, there's a million ways to talk about the same topics. So great job on those. Y'all are doing a great job of staying caught up, and I appreciate those of you who have delays or conflicts that's going to affect, when you're able to post. You're letting me know, which is great. That's perfect. So just stay in touch with me. And, again, if you have any questions, we're continuing to have links that are not up to date. I'm hoping this week that you won't find any that I missed, but anything's possible. The school and the people involved are working hard to try to get everything updated, and it's just a process. So I appreciate your patience. So thoughts for this upcoming week. We're starting to dive, more deeply into the categories of diagnostic, the diagnostic categories in the DSM. So I'm going to continue to go week by week and video by video to decide whether to leave the pre-recorded lectures in place or replace pieces of them as needed. The first video this week, for example, references changes from the DSM-4 TR to the DSM-5. And I decided to leave it because in the scheme of things, as you get into the field, the way that we diagnosed before the DSM-5 was not that long ago. And so you could easily come across clinician perspectives or references in things that you read or you're learning or in paperwork as you get further into the field. Things that you're going to come across in terms of diagnosis could still reference that multi-axial system from the DSM-4 and 4TR. So I think it's helpful to still hear about the changes from the 4TR to the 5, because we are in a time of a lot of change in terms of how we think about diagnosis, and hopefully much of it is beneficial. It's also really important that you read the links, that I post about the changes from the DSM-5 to the DSM-5TR. And last week I had you only read, the ones for those 2 sections that you were reading through. But be sure to keep that link from last week about the changes, because at the bottom, below the things that you had to read last week, are updates specific to particular diagnostic categories or diagnoses. And so as we go through, as we come to diagnoses that have updates, you'll want to go back and look at those links. Again, I'll do my best to point out each of those, and give modifiers for anything that we need to pay attention to. But if you're not doing the readings, you can very well miss some important things. So again, there were far more changes between the 4TR and the 5 than there are between the 5 and the 5TR, but you still want to be sure that you know what the most recent changes are. And those links from psychiatry.org, I think is the APA website, you want to know what those are. And that's where you find them. Okay. Last thing, and you'll want to look at the link for this. The one added diagnosis that's new in the category this week that we're looking at in terms of diagnoses that typically, happen, or that the symptoms of which typically happen during childhood. The one thing that fits into this week's category is prolonged grief disorder. So that is a new diagnostic label in this DSM, and it includes specifiers for children and adolescents. So you want to take a look at that. Dr. Mabry does reference this in one of this week's mini lectures, but in all likelihood, you are not going to be diagnosing many of the things in this initial section in terms of the intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, ADHD. Professionals with more specific training in these areas are typically going to be the people doing the diagnosing. It's not necessarily true of conduct disorder and the things in that category. You know, if you're working with kids, you may be looking at those things. But most of the disorders that are considered sort of developmental in nature often require a more robust diagnostic system than social workers are going to be part of. But that's not necessarily true. If you're a school social worker, or if you're working in a context where these are some of the things that you're, you know, working with, then you may become a part of that, or you may get that extra training. Okay, so even if you're not diagnosing these things, that doesn't mean you don't need to know this content. I would say that not more than a couple of weeks goes by on a regular basis in my clinical work, where I'm working with adults, that there isn't a discussion around some of this content. Whether we're talking about appropriateness of the therapy to a particular client and discussing, you know, their sort of background or diagnoses, or referring them for additional resources, or making sure that we're conceptualizing their treatment accurately. I will also say that this is an area where much work and research is being done, and changes in the way that we conceptualize these disorders or approach these disorders, or even whether we see them as disorders, is changing rapidly, right? And as research continues, and as we gain more data and more understanding, the research will continue to change, and the way that we approach it will continue to change. So it's really important that you stay up to date, and you can do that yourself by going to trainings or reading, you know, the most recent research, or by having close colleagues, people that you're regularly in contact with, who stay up to date on those things. You know, you want to stay up to date, because our knowledge gets outdated really quickly as the field changes quickly. So none of us can stay on top of the research in every aspect of social work or the mental health field. So supervision and collaboration and ongoing training are really important. So don't feel stressed that you need to be the expert on everything, because you can't be. But you can place yourself in a position and with connections where you have access to those things. I also want to make a side note here in reference to the broad category that we currently refer to as sort of neurodivergence or neurodiversity. There's the more current terms that we use. Most of the time when we say that, we mean autism or ADHD. But this is just sort of a soapbox for me in working with a lot of adults who have these, either have these diagnoses or probably could have these diagnoses if they went through the process. So if you're working with autistic or other neurodiverse people, try really hard not to get stuck on technical language. That doesn't mean you don't want to know what the technical, official language for it is, but try not to get stuck there, because if you're stuck on technical language, you risk alienating people. Talk to the individuals that you're working with and ask what language they prefer. So Dr. Mabry several times has referenced person-first language, and it is generally considered best practice in the mental health world to use person-first language. So in other words, a person with bipolar disorder, a person with a disability, rather than a disabled person or, a Down syndrome kid, right? Like, it is a person who has a condition or a disorder. However, there's a significant segment of people who are diagnosed on the autism spectrum disorder, and you see this a lot in non-professional settings, so subreddits, Discord servers, other social media, where people are strongly advocating to be called an autistic person rather than a person with autism. Now, obviously, the DSM is in conflict with this mindset. But essentially, and this is me paraphrasing what some of my clients and people in my life have told me about their preferences in terms of language. There is a increasing mindset that autism is not something that needs to be fixed, right? It's not a lot of people don't see it as a disorder that needs to be treated. It's just a way of somebody's brain being wired. And a significant percentage of our population, their brains are just wired differently. And this is kind of an odd side note, but I have one client that we talk a lot about. If you've ever seen the X-Men movies, Professor Xavier has cerebro, or whatever it's called, which is this sort of crown thing that he puts on his head because his mutation or his special power is that he can connect with the thoughts of everybody in the universe all at the same time. And it has the potential to make him insane, but he has figured out a way to sort of channel it and use it as a beneficial thing. And so he has this crown thing that he puts on when he's making these connections. And so it's like this extra layer of infinite connections that his brain can make when he's wearing this crown. So my client and I, years ago, determined that for them, in their experience, and everybody's experience is different, having autism is kind of like wearing cerebro, right? Like it is a regular brain plus all these extra layers of connections. Now, I'm not suggesting that this can't create problems in people's lives. I'm not suggesting that there isn't some disorder, some distress that can go along with it. And obviously, there's a huge range of people with autism, in terms of people who it really affects their intellectual functioning, or, shows up in other ways in their life that really is very difficult to deal with. And then there are people who you wouldn't necessarily know that they are autistic, even spending a ton of time with them, and even if they're not masking, even if they haven't learned to hide it, but just because they function like in a way that doesn't make them seem disordered. This is not great language, but I'm hoping you understand what I'm saying. So I'm not telling you should think about autism this way. I'm not telling you what language you should use for it or how you should conceive of autism. But I am saying ask the people that you're working with, especially if you're working with adults, how they want to refer to it, how they want to refer to themselves. Because there are lots of people with autism who don't believe it's a disorder. They believe it's just the way their brain is structured. And that the problem is not that they have a disorder, but that we live in a culture and a society that is not built for different ways of functioning. It's built for one standard way of functioning, like our educational system. And so if you are neurodiverse or neurodivergent and you're not neurotypical, and you're functioning in a system that is built for neurotypical brains, you're going to seem like you're disordered, even though it's the system that is inflexible. So again, I say all this not to contradict the diagnostic criteria. This is the way that we diagnose and understand autism has changed a lot, but it's still considered a disorder, and I'm not trying to say one way or the other whether that's true. But this is just my side note as we think about the way that the stigma of diagnosis affects people and the way that you approach the people who fall into these categories. So neurodiverse people, we have the option to fight stigma by letting them tell us how they want to be referred to. And if we can do this with gender and pronouns, then we can certainly also do it with neurodiverse people. Just be conscious of the language that we use. So that's my thought on that. I could talked about it more than I intended to, but hopefully that is helpful. Okay. Last thought on that is that the diagnosis of autism and ADHD also to a certain extent, but not as historically frequently as autism, there are still challenges when it comes to getting an accurate diagnosis, especially for people who were biologically assigned female at birth, whether they still express themselves as female or not. Historically, the testing and assessment data for most things, for learning styles and learning disabilities and just life in general, is normed on white males. And so testing in the past has not always been accurate or accessible for people who are not white males. And again, there are sections in the current DSM that talk about, cultural aspects and things that affect this. And our research and methods continue to improve. They're not perfect. But I do know plenty of adults in recent years who have been tested and told that they didn't meet criteria for either ADHD or autism. And then if they persisted in getting more kind of rigorous testing or, go to a place with more specialization or more experience or whatever, then they do meet criteria. So this has happened again for people that I know for both ADHD and autism. And it is valuable. This is my point. It's valuable to believe people, which doesn't mean we're encouraging everybody to give themselves a TikTok-based diagnosis, but people know themselves and they know their experiences. And so sometimes they know self-diagnosis is a thing, right? Like, it doesn't carry any weight legally or ethically or in terms of, medical, like insurance and things like that. But unless it is something that will create problems for somebody, like they are wanting to spend thousands of dollars on testing that they really don't have, or, there are I guess within reason, there are other reasons why you might not encourage somebody to pursue diagnosis further. But unless there are real limitations or real harm that could be caused by them pursuing it, believe people, support them, help them find resources. Because the testing and the process of diagnosis is not always accurate. Okay, so those are my soapbox thoughts on the content that you're going to look at this week. I would, again, if you have resources that you want to share, with me or with the class, I'm always happy to hear them. We try to update the materials as we go, but sometimes not everything gets updated. And so if you have resources on some of this content, disorders that are usually first diagnosed in childhood, I would love to hear it. And I'm sure your classmates would love to hear it too. So feel free to share, and if there isn't a forum or a place for you to do that, you can let me know and I'll set something up. But I look forward to reading your thoughts on this content this week. And I think that's it for now. So hope you all have a good week. Again, be in touch if you need anything, and we're just going to keep going. Y'all are doing great. Thanks.